It is my great pleasure to introduce the next panel, which, as a student of urban planning, I'm particularly excited about myself, entitled Imagining Spaces of Return and Mapping Palestinian Liberation. Now, we're joined today for the panel by moderator Professor Salim Tamari, as well as panelists Linda Quiquivix, Einat Manoff, and Professor Thomas Abowd. Salim Tamari is the Institute for Palestine Studies Senior Fellow and the former director of the IPS-affiliated Institute of Jerusalem Studies. He is editor of Jerusalem Quarterly and Hawliyat al-Quds. He is professor of sociology at Birzeit University and an adjunct professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. He has authored several works on urban culture, political sociology, biography, and social history, and the social history of the Eastern Mediterranean. Recent publications include Year of the Locust, Palestine and Syria during World War I, Ihsan's War, The Intimate Life of an Ottoman Soldier, Biography and Social History of Bilad al-Sham, Pilgrims, Lepers, and Stuffed Cabbage, Essays on Jerusalem's Cultural History, Reinterpreting the Historical Records, The Uses of Palestinian Refugee Archives for Social Science, Research, and Policy Analysis, and finally, Mountain Against the Sea, Palestine's Unfulfilled Modernity. Professor Tamari is currently a visiting professor at Harvard University. Of the panelists, the first to be speaking will be Linda Quiquivix. Linda Quiquivix is an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow in critical global humanities at Brown's Kogut Center. Her work critically examines the constructions of maps and borders in the modern era. Of central interest to her work is how people struggling for autonomy from a regime, nation-state, or other powerful social system contest dominant spatial arrangements and create new ones. She took her doctorate in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2012. Following will be Einat Manoff with a paper entitled Countermapping and the Geographical Imagination, Mapping Spatial Scenarios of Return. And I apologize, Linda Quiquivix's paper will be entitled Liberation or Independence, Palestine as Land or Palestine as Territory. So back to the biography of Einat Manoff. Einat is an urban designer and a scholar activist whose research focuses on participatory methods and theories, including participatory action research, PAR, community-based planning, and countermapping. Working with these inclusionary approaches, she collaborates with communities to promote local-based action and research around planning for justice. Einat is currently a PhD student in the Environmental Psychology program at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She teaches geography and urban affairs at the CUNY colleges. She is a 2012-2013 Urban Fellow at the Public Science Project. Finally, we'll have panelist Thomas Abowd presenting a paper entitled The Return of Homes and the Restitution of History in Jerusalem. Thomas Abowd teaches in the Department of Anthropology at Tufts University. He has been involved for 2 decades in scholarly and activist projects related to Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East. He is the author of the upcoming book, Colonial Jerusalem, The Spatial Construction of Identity and Difference in a Divided City. Thomas is also the author of National Boundaries, Colonized Spaces, The Gendered Politics of Residential Space in Contemporary Jerusalem. He is at work on a study of racial politics in Detroit that details Arab American and Black class, racial, and gendered encounters. He has been awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to do research in Jerusalem, Palestine in 2012. Please join me in welcoming our next panel.
Thank you, Alex. The title of this panel is Imagining Space of Return, and we have 3 very interesting presentations which address practical issues of return in the imaginatory and reconceptualization of ways we have been thinking about mapping discourse databases such as the UNCCP, and also practical visitation procedures. I'm very lucky and unlucky not to have received the papers today, so I can imagine what the speakers will say. But I have enough knowledge of the speakers, so what I will say might highlight, but also will have to be readjusted after the papers are given. Linda Quiquivix makes a very provocative statement about how scholarship, activism, and political practice unwittingly hinder the road to liberation. She makes a distinction between notions of liberation and independence, which I think will be fleshed out in her notions of mapping. She attacks or she criticizes conventional mapping in order to introduce ways in which indigenous local knowledge has been rethinking about public space and private space, and how people have been mapping their own imagery of Palestine. And we will see some of this on the wall in a minute. So the main theme of this issue is alternative mapping of Palestine in the imagery of refugees. Einat Manoff, who is engaged with a group that I highly admire in Israel called Zochorot, mentions of return as a very abstract notion. And also, like Kiki, is considering notions of counter-mapping in the geographical imagination. These counter-mapping exercises are actually involved in practical visitations to sites which either do not exist now or have been obliterated from the physical map in order to be brought about to life by actual practices of visitation. And this is something we'll hear about in a minute. And last but not least, Tom Abowd addresses the issues of West Jerusalem property in the construction of refugee identity. He will address, I suspect, the whole issue of the use of UNCCP records, which we heard about in the last session. Am I correct? And in order to see how the official understanding of restitution can be different from practical direct notions of restitution. This is something I am personally very interested in, and I hope to make some comments about it at the end in terms of the use and abuse of UNCCP records. So without further ado, I will introduce the speakers.
Thank you so much to the organizers, especially for putting on this conference, and for all of you for attending. I think I'll begin my presentation by addressing something that occurred yesterday. I put forth a question to a panelist yesterday on whether the fight for indigeneity was a wise one, in that in Israel-Palestine, something really interesting is that the colonizer makes claims to indigeneity, and the world believes them more than they do the Palestinians, or at least the world of those institutions above. And I was asked afterward by a lot of people if I could expand on that notion, and it wasn't so much on the question of indigeneity that I was worried about, but more about the question of sovereignty. And I brought to the attention of the panelists and people who asked me later the ways of organizing of other movements for liberation in the past and in the present, highlighting the Black Panther Party, in that for the black condition in the Western Hemisphere, but arguably also in Africa, the question of sovereignty is an impossible question, because there is no place where people can point to having been from. having been disembedded from Africa, from their history. They have no access of time and space that can be legible for the kind of politics that the world deems proper. The Black Panther Party in the 1960s and 70s takes up this question after so many attempts for Black people to make claims to Black nationalism, to sovereignty, and said it is an impossibility, so we need to create the world completely differently. The Zapatistas today are saying the same thing, even though they are confused by so many people who don't know what they're doing as an indigenous rights movement. They refuse to be thought of as an indigenous rights movement. They do not seek to make claims for indigeneity, they seek to make claims for autonomy, for self-determination, and they make a very strong distinction between sovereignty and self-determination, seeing them as opposed rather than conflated. And I wanted to bring that up to set up my talk in talking about how this tension between sovereignty and self-determination seems to manifest itself within the Palestinian movement as well, in the tension between independence and liberation, which is what the movement has talked about for a really long time. So what I'll do is I will look at the way that investigating the history of mapping Palestine can point to this and maybe point toward creative ways forward. Now, it's a conceptual intervention, but because it focuses so much on the role of power, it asks in our concept of power that we understand other ways of exercising power in order to open up a space for the practical implementation of the right of return. I begin with the premise that our conceptions of space are bound to the politics that we adopt. And what I want to do is look at, if that's true, what our reliance on the use of maps in thinking about the conflict and any potential solution has us think about what political power is like. Because in the history of mapping Palestine in the modern era, maps have been used as tools for dispossession. It's a history of colonialism. And so then I want to make 2 points on this. One is spatial, and one is at the level of space, and one is at the level of power. At the level of space, the point I want to make is that modern mapping practices create space as an object for control from above. And at the political, at the level of power, a related point that I want to make is that the production of space as an object to be ruled over also produces a relation of domination, of sovereignty, rather than one of self-determination. And I will tease that out very briefly before beginning. What I want to say about the relation of sovereignty is that it's a relation of domination-obedience. It does not fully allow us to truly collectively determine our lives. Its greatest myth is that we cannot act as creative actors. The only relation of power that it allows us is one of victim, where we are acted upon, or one of protester, where we act against. It doesn't allow for this creative relation. For the Palestine case, I find the production of space within this tension maybe usefully understood as a distinction between the production of territory, this object of sovereign control, pitted against maybe Palestinian conceptions of Palestine as land, which is much harder for me to describe to you because it may be that it's not so easily seen as the way that territory is on a map. So I'll begin very briefly by just orienting us. We know we're in the Middle East and North Africa, circa 2000s, 21st century. These are the borders. I want to point out that when Palestine and the area first started being mapped by the West, those borders didn't exist. The Ottoman Empire in 1800 was not so worried about territory in the modern sense, but what was important territory or territorial control was trade routes, and that included the seas. But then we get here, our area of focus, Palestine, we get its borders in 1923, and this is kind of how we begin the story with historic Palestine. The set of maps that we're all used to is this one, the UN partition, the armistice lines, the Six-Day War, noticing that now we have the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, the Camp David Treaty, where we no longer have Sinai in our mental map, but we do the Golan and the West Bank and Gaza. When we get to the peace process, even though the Golan Heights is still occupied, it's not in our mental maps. And this signals that shift for so many Palestinian intellectuals from liberation to independence, where now the movement is just so isolated and concentrated on a status kind of project. And what it has done is it has removed from our mental map the Golan Heights, but not only that, but looking at this incredibly powerful map, which is so dominant in the way that we think about Israel-Palestine in its sequence, right? A critique I'd like to put forward of this map, and I don't want to say that we should not use it. I think that we absolutely should. It's incredibly good. But a critique is, in its dominance, what we lose is talking about how Palestine is not just about Palestine. We don't have, again, the Golan Heights. We don't have even references to neighboring countries, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. We don't have references to where Palestinians are. We don't have the Palestinians of Israel on this map. You would come to think that this is really just a conflict about territory rather than the link of Palestinians and Palestine, wherever that might be. So in the history then of Palestine's mapping, modern mapping, and by that what I mean is the measurement of space in an accurate way so that it can be known by an external power, by people who don't live there. People who live there don't need maps. It's a history of warfare, of a biblical crusade in the 19th century, then as of one of bounding land, of bordering land, and then a cadastre of private property. So beginning with back to the Eastern question, when the Ottoman Empire did not have borders, we get here, I mentioned earlier, that territorial control, which included the seas, was important. And so we get the first mapping of Palestine, the first modern mapping or triangulation measurement on the ground by Napoleon's cartographers circa 1800. And it's a map for warfare. Here you can see it was a map of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean in the Encyclopedia of Egypt. And what this map was for, it's such a really great case study to show that societies make maps only when maps call for them. And the map that Napoleon's army was calling for was one of ground and coastal, naval and ground warfare. Because as you can see, here's a sheet for Gaza. The coasts are impeccably measured. They're really great. They're really accurate. And there's also topography. So it's for naval and ground warfare. They didn't go inland. But here is the sheet for Jerusalem and Jaffa. And again, the coasts and the terrain along the coasts are pretty accurate. But again, they did not go inland, but they wanted to include Jerusalem anyway. And you can kind of see the little caterpillar mountains more inland. They're not accurately measured. This was a map for, again, naval and ground warfare. Then you get the Crusader map, or the Neo-Crusader maps of the 19th century, where you had biblical scholars taking the Bible literally as a historical document and wanting to prove it as fact. And you get, in this case, the Palestine Exploration Fund's map of Western Palestine that wanted to bound for the first time in modern history the borders of the Promised Land, from Dan up north in Benyas to Beersheba down in the south. And this map was created under the guise of science and religion, but was created by the British War Office, largely because they needed a map. They were trying to protect the Ottoman Empire from having more incursions from Russia and from other European powers. This map was the most accurate map of Palestine for the next 50 years, and it was a map that Allenby used to capture Jerusalem 50 years later. Jerusalem as a gift to the British people, as Lord George requested. Here is one sheet, and I'll just zoom in to show here's Bethlehem. And what was important was, of course, the religious sites. They were trying to prove that these religious events actually took place. But also you have the mapping of roads. This was a military map as much as it was a scientific and a religious map. Next you get the bounding of the area. Here's our Sykes-Picot map. And this, I want to point out, is not at all unique to the area. This was just the logic of the time. Here is the partition or the carving up scramble for Africa. Oh, before I move on, what I want to say, something that's really interesting about having this logic of lines, of carving up the world in lines, is a very, very new phenomenon in modern thinking, largely one brought by colonialism. The first time lines were discussed in treaties was the Treaty of Tordesillas between the Portuguese and the Spanish, who wanted to carve up the new world, the Americas, between them. And so this is the line that then creates Brazil and then the Spanish-speaking South America. This logic then comes to other parts of the world, including Europe, whereas territory in Europe was not understood as a homogeneous chunk of earth bounded with lines. It was understood as a list of places, not unlike the Ottoman Empire. It had different conceptualizations of territory. Going back to that Palestine Exploration Fund map, which was the most accurate map of Palestine until the British Mandate, here is a zoomed-in shot of it, and then 50 years later, the same area by the British survey that wanted to create Palestine into even smaller chunks of delineated lines of private property. So you see now you have these lines where they did not exist before. This was part of a private property land settlement project initiated in a lot of ways by the Zionist movement so that they could legally purchase land. But it was also initiated by the British themselves, as they were doing in so many parts of the world. They wanted people to discipline themselves into seeking assistance with the courts and judges and the police over territorial disputes and any other kinds of disputes. Whereas previously, many times borders were decided upon between neighbors. It's that tree to that tree. That was a social relation where people actually talk to each other to figure things out. When you get the private property mapping, the cadastral mapping, and the juridico-political conception of space, you now have to go to the courts to settle these kinds of things, and this is an outside, unaccountable party. What's so interesting about the history of these maps, though, that rarely gets talked about is the resistance in their production. Now, as we see here, by 1948, this was the area that the British managed to settle individual private title to, but so many areas refused it, and especially the areas that had the Masha'a, the common lands, where there was not one individual owner. There were the village. The village was the owner in a lot of ways. And you notice here that it kind of resembles what the armistice lines would, right? And in fact, when the logic of partition was introduced under the Peel Commission, which absolutely detested the common lands, the Masha'a system, understood that the peasants were holding onto it, refusing to allow it to be titled for individual property and to be mapped because they were trying to guard themselves from Jewish land purchases. So here is an actual quote from the Peel Commission. In certain areas, the Arabs regard the system, the Masha, of tenancy, destructive as it all is of development, according to the British, as a safeguard against alienation. In other words, through the sale to immigrant Jews, and that the administration had been reluctant for political reasons to abolish it by legislation. So a really important reason why the British were not able to settle these areas was because they were afraid of the Palestinians. Moving on really quickly, in pointing out to then these kinds of practices, these exercises of power from below, what I want to point to is how Palestinians used the map, like so many anti-colonial movements did, as a logo to rally around. But what's so interesting about them is that if you see this poster, an early PLA poster, you also have icons of armed struggle and women and children, a popular struggle, not just a territorialist struggle. And also in logos, Fatah and the PFLP, you have the map. In Fatah, you have armed struggle is important, and then for PFLP, you have the return. Also, Yasser Arafat, his kafiyah, supposedly it took an hour for him to fix it this way, according to one biographer. By the 1980s, you start getting really sophisticated cartography of Palestine by Palestinians. This is a map that took 5 years, 1983 to 88, to be completed. And you notice the legend, it continues calling, first of all, it maps all of historic Palestine, but it also calls Jewish areas settlements, not cities, not towns, but settlements. By the time you get to the peace process, though, only a few years later, this is the frame that the Palestinian negotiators used to map. And what's so interesting about it is that in questions, for example, of Jerusalem, it's impossible. I would submit it's impossible. Here is a frame by which just the negotiators maybe use, and it even includes East Jerusalem in the West Bank. And if you notice, Jerusalem is theoretically like modern maps on Cartesian plane. They take Jerusalem, they take all areas to be of equal value and of equal importance. And if you look at the font size of Jerusalem and Ramallah and Tel Aviv Yafo and Tulkarem, the font size is exactly the same, right? This is completely different from pre-modern conceptions of space, sacred space of Jerusalem, where this was the map of Jerusalem. And not just the map of Jerusalem, but the map of the world. Jerusalem was the center of the world. And you have the three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. This is a late medieval map where you have the Americas also because they just figured them out. But they didn't really know what to do with them because the Bible never said anything about it, right? And what's so interesting about it is that in the negotiations, the Israelis will refuse to even talk about Jerusalem because it's too sacred. But you have Olmert telling the Palestinian negotiation, well, it's only 0.04% of the West Bank anyway. So that tension reveals how Jerusalem, while trying to be forced into this conception of modern Cartesian space, into territory, is still too sacred and cannot be mapped in that way, right? Something really interesting is refugee counter-cartography. This is on Google Earth, whereas in the negotiations on the left side, this is the acceptable frame, the yellow, from where to map. The refugees don't pay attention to that. And they map inside 48. And this map, actually, when it first came out on Google Earth, using a lot of Salman Abu Sitta's work, it proved itself to be much more threatening than any map that the Palestinian negotiating team had ever made. It caused a lot of a scandal in Israel because the map became so popular. The person that made it, Thamin Darby, he was always on the Google community, and because he was using Google Earth so much, and then he makes this map. the Google Earth used to have like the best of the Google Earth community, and they featured it worldwide. And one of the towns where an Arab village was put on, a little pin on threatened to sue Google because of it. So again, much more threatening, much more antagonistic coming from below than from above. You have a question?
Could you just say exactly what those red marks?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, those marks are all the village, the 48 villages, the Palestinian 48 villages. And if you click on one of them, you get pictures, you get narratives, stories, oral histories. Yeah. Also in refugee camps, this is the map you see. You never see a map of the West Bank and Gaza, right? So these are mapping practices from below that are just so frightening. I mean, this map has no authority on the ground, but it's incredibly powerful. It scares the Zionist movement so much more than any negotiating team maps do. This is a really interesting project, Subjective Atlas of Palestine, in that coming from artists, you have various ideas of where Palestine is. And here is a map of where the refugees are scattered worldwide. That's Palestine. You also get this map of Ramallah put on top of the wall, showing its extremities, and here's another version of it. You have a dead-end road on this side, a prison on this side, a settlement on the other side that the map just does not show you. What's interesting about Subjective Atlas is that it's mostly not maps. It's a lot of everyday life stuff and culture, and here is Palestinian music collection. Here is garbage keeping Ramallah clean. Here's a letter from a prisoner to his mother telling her that from prison, telling her I learned to read and write. That's Palestine too. Where they do have maps, they are fanciful and actually incredibly sophisticated, I would argue, and I'll give you two examples. One is this bottom one here of Palestine on top and below. So this is, for me, this is kind of what A.L. Weizmann and others have written about. Any two-state solution would really create two states on top of each other, winding and warming, where Jews never have to see Palestinians connected through tunnels and bridges. And then another one is, this is one of my favorite. I want to write an entire essay on it. Because in a lot of ways, it's right. This is really just a game. That's rigged in many ways in the number of possibilities that are allowed. Another project, and I'll wrap up with this one, is one that I've been working on in Aida refugee camp. Now, I went to Aida refugee camp to just hang out with little kids, teach them art while they taught me Arabic. And then in the camp, Laji Center that I was working with found out that I was a geographer, and they asked me if I could map the camp. And this was when I was doing my dissertation research, the early parts of it. And I wanted to say, no, maps have ruined everything. Haven't you been paying attention to what I've been saying? But what was really great is that we had these really awesome conversations together about, of course, the dangers of mapping. Maybe the Israelis would get them. They say, well, the Israelis already have them. We don't have maps. And so then we talked about how do we have this progressive, emancipatory relationship to the map. And it comes as we do it. And I'll give you an example of one, but just to set the camp. Here is, I managed to get a high-res aerial photograph of the camp that Israel took, the military took, that sold to private contractors, and then a Palestinian cartographer got it and gave it to me. Because on Google Earth, by the way, Israel is the only country that does not allow, it's banned to have high-resolution imagery of by US congressional decree. So I had to get this from other places, and so so the wall is up on the top, up there, and just more of a ground view version. Here's the wall, and on the other side is the olive orchard that was stolen from the camp, and then settlement, and then Jerusalem is that way, and Jerusalem is incredibly close. People will walk there. It takes less than an hour. But going back to it, here's the aerial photograph. We mapped the camp buildings, the streets, some trees, the wall. The black dots are the sniper towers. which in their size are very small, but in their reach they're very wide. So something that will map is the reach of the bullets. Lifting out one layer. Here's the map that, with the 1 minute that I have left, I want to leave you with. Lifting out one layer of the streets. This is a map that I traced, the professional cartographer, with my GIS, fancy geography software. And here are the streets, Ida streets. And I was showing them to someone in the camp that I was working with, Nidal Al-Azraq over there, who was helping me just make sure that I was tracing things correctly, because the camp is so crowded, you can't see too much from the aerial photograph. And I was asking him, are the streets okay? And as he was looking at them, he said, the rooftops are also streets. And I asked him to draw it. And the story, and he can tell you so much more, is this is how he sees the streets when you're under curfew and you will be shot at if you use the streets that the cartographer is telling you are there. He made his own streets, from jumping building to building to building. Now, for me, this is so important to recognize how the limitations that professionals, professional cartographers, I'm using myself as an example, have people who don't live in the area, right? This is why we've needed maps so much, because we don't know the area. And this is why they haven't really needed maps. I was showing one of the youth the map of the camp from above, and he says, and he couldn't orient himself. He's like, I've never seen the camp this way, because he always sees it from below, from the alleys, from the rooftops, right? But then he said, oh yeah, I did see it one time. I saw it when I was arrested, and the Israelis asked me to point out my house, which is how they get their stuff. So I'll leave you with that, and then maybe we can talk some more in Q&A.
On the desktop, if you can just move mine. Sorry, I don't know. This one, yeah. And then I just click, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I want to thank you again for inviting me to participate in this evocative, shaking, brilliant, poetic conference, one of the best I've been to. Thanks again to the brilliant team of organizers, really inspiring work. And to Mike, and the thank yous. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. I also want to thank my co-panelist, Linda Quiquivix, who by some kind of serendipitous way of events found my work and linked me to this panel, and is just now my new comrade and colleague. I also want to thank Chris and Rick Colbeth-Hess from Palestine Solidarity for graciously hosting me during my visit. I'll start. As a Jewish Israeli woman, I am honored and humbled for this opportunity to share this space with all of you, and would like to take a chance to dispute and grapple with a colonial present while imagining a possible future of justice in Palestine. Doing this while addressing some of the material and physical implications and redressing them to facilitate in a larger sort of imagining of alternative for peace. Pragmatically planning for return of all Palestinian refugees and expellees. So I'm going to, and Kiki's work was really great as a sort of a way of explaining the colonial power relations of maps, because I'm going to talk about a particular project which is called counter mapping return. I'm not going to go into what we already know about Israel's, but the 2 points that this project is sort of trying to intervene with is one, the cartographic gaze, which has been ever present in the region and as a tool of colonial practices, and also sort of grappling with is the Israel's denial, continually ongoing denial and rejection of the notion of right of refugee return. And in the same way, also the denial of the Palestinian Nakba and its ongoing formations, a substantial depression and loss, not only to land, but also that everything that was conquered during the 1948 war, but also everything that is ongoing afterwards, the ongoing Nakba. Of large-scale expropriation of Arab land that has been taking place since then, and it's taking place in the settlements, but also in insidious, various ways across the land, and it's something that is really hard to resist if you don't understand all the ways in which it's happening. And so, in a way, this is kind of a project which is trying at the same time to learn and analyze, but also intervene with. It is also looking at. So to that, I would like to add the 65 years of Jewish habitation, Israeli occupation, and enclosures, producing deep internal racial segregation, which intensified over the past 30 years due to Israel's adoption of neoliberalism. A few of the panels have raised this before, but I feel like I have to say it, that colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, chauvinism, and militarism are all one and the same. They work in the same ways, and if we want to dismantle colonialism, we really have to think about this intervening with the capitalist structures that are right now holding the land. So while thinking of all that, there's a dilapidated left in Israel that is supported by the US government that can only imagine as far as a separatist solution of a two-state something, a separatist notion of a two-state. I don't want to call it solution because that already embodies the paradox. So the contentious nature around this kind of denial of both Nakba, ongoing Nakba, and return led us to the production of a participatory mapping workshop called Counter Mapping Return. Counter Mapping Return set out to investigate the environmental implications, potentials, and obstacles of planning for refugee return from the twofold or multiple folds of perspectives of Jewish Israeli and that of Palestinians. The project collaborators shared a connection to Miske, an expropriated Palestinian town that served as a case study for the mapping exercise. Participants included NGO Zechrot volunteer activist, which Liat is going to talk about, the director of which is sitting in the audience, so then I will not talk a lot about. But they graciously hosted and co-imagined and were just wonderful friends and comrades. So the participants included NGO Zechrot volunteer activists, Israeli Jews and Palestinians who are peace activists, all peace activists, members of the organization's directorate, and representatives from the Committee of Miske Expellees, which have been working on refugee and Palestinian rights of return to Miske for the past many years. Those who I've worked with all live in the Arab-Israeli town of Tira, whose members are officially full citizens but are subject to assaults on their rights, properties, and personal safety on a daily basis. During the workshop, we examined various issues connected to the return of refugees and expellees and formulated proposals conceptualizing the territorial implications of return in order to develop a schematic, spatial outline for return. Together, we reimagined Miske as a site of inclusion, where a complex solidarity and political alliance will be or was formed. The premise of the workshop, I suggest, and this is taking into account everything that we've heard so far, that there is a denial around return that is a product of an inability on the part of Israeli Jews to imagine the practical manifestations of return within a larger framework of social and spatial justice. This is evident because even Jewish-Israeli peace activists are not able to imagine return as something that will emancipate all of us. A lack in what geography, lack in something that is called the geographical imagination. It's a term coined by Marxist geographer David Harvey, whose work I really admire. And Harvey describes it as an inability or ability to link the social imagination to a spatial material consciousness. So our project set out to dismantle return as an abstract concept and investigate return to a specific place and its material implication. And this place is Miske. So Miske was a small village, and now I guess would be town, in the Tulkarem district of Palestine under British mandate. The 1945 census placed Miske's population at 1,060, with 123 houses counted. In 1948, commemorated in the Nakba, Miske's Arab inhabitants were expelled by the orders of the Haganah. Similar to numerous cases throughout the land, Miske's property was seized and the village was torn down in 1952. The school building and the mosque were left standing, and in 2006, the school was torn down because Zochot and the Miskais were holding peaceful poetry readings and commemorations. So as soon as it started to become a place of memory work, it also was torn down. The agricultural land were in 1952 handed over to the management of the Israeli Lands Trust, which has turned a blind eye to the Jewish cooperative agricultural land, the Moshavim settlements that have steadily sprawled over the territory for over 60 years. The village was erased from the ground. Eucalyptus trees were planted as a strategy. If you don't know this, some of you might know this. Strategy of the IDF was to plant eucalyptus trees to mask the ruins. And so we would, as growing up as Zionist Jews, we would go on field trip to these forests and look at the ruins, and we imagined them to be Roman ruins. We didn't realize the history was so recent and so burning. Obviously, this village was erased from the official state map, a cartographic colonialist practice, a common cartographic colonialist practice, but is obviously forevermore engraved in collective Palestinian memories. And also, those Jews who live on the space have a memory of this uprootedness. So I guess I'll jump into, and I'm taking a moment to dive into the actual process of debating around return to a specific place, which is Miske, between Jewish-Israeli peace activists and Palestinians who have this particular position, they also have an ID card, so they can travel back to their homeland, and they can't resettle it, but they can see it and touch the ground. And so, but I want to talk about the kind of negotiations of space, because I think this project is an intervention into, as for return to be managed also and organized in local ways. So counter mapping is in a way an intervention with colonialism, but also let's not wait until Israel decides to listen to the law, or the law is enforced on international law is enforced on Israel. Let's think of ways of similar ways of organizing around return. And I think this project opens up a particular political, geographical imagination on how we might do that, not without its problems. And so I'm going to share with you some of the problems towards this kind of negotiation. So in this map-making process, we challenged the states of formal maps, appropriated its official techniques of representations, and made our own alternative maps. So basically, everything that Kiki has just showed us, we have basically co-researched together. We studied extensively the atlas produced by Professor Abowd, and we studied the historical maps pre-1948, and we also intervened with a map by each one of the co-researchers traced their own story of uprootedness or of colonialism, and brought in their environmental biographies into the map. And so each one made sort of a retrace of the map through their own stories of uprootedness. Yes. So again, I'm not going to tell you how we got the maps, but yeah, my colleague just she sort of kind of alluded to that. But yeah, you know who controls the sky and the cartographic gaze from above in Israel. Since you can't get it from Google Earth, you can assume how we managed to find the aerial photography. So the mapping group rarely avoided reducing the fraught political question of return to a set of lines on a map, nor did we presume to achieve any balance between violated rights and compensation. But we did want to imagine a future of return. So before we started, we had the group insisted on a couple of principles to be articulated before we had began our mapping work, and I will relay them to you. First is that the map and mapping exercises are an experiment and reflect only the ideas of the members of the mapping group, the core researchers, in order to avoid claiming to represent those uprooted from Miske who are now in the Palestinian diaspora or those living in the refugee camps. This goes to some of the previous panels' discussion around the fragmented sort of longing of the idea. On the other hand, we also wanted to avoid falsely speaking on behalf of the Jewish Israeli public. The second claim is that although we said we're not representing, we are planning for a return of all generations of refugees internally displaced from Miske. The plan will not involve the demolition of what currently exists. So this was, nor will it try to recreate the past. In other words, no house will be destroyed. Current aerial photographs of Miske reveal this to be a specifically easy case, and easy, I don't have a better word for it, case study due to the eucalyptus grove planted in its center, and basically preserved agricultural land. And so the agricultural land are still there, just owned by the Israeli Land Trust, and no houses were built on what used to be built ground. And so we didn't need to think about what's happening, how do we go back to houses. I know it's not the case in many other places in Israel, and Jerusalem, and Haifa, and Jaffa, and everywhere. Another concern voiced from the onset was related to the unavoidable problem that arise from doing politics at the local level. So I'll touch that, but also goes in relation to other panels in this conference. It's what geographers call the local trap. It's that when people assume emancipatory politics are inherent to just doing ground-up approaches, just because when you lower and make the scale smaller. So we discussed there's nothing inherently emancipatory about doing this work, but we argued that maybe broader issues that will be mirrored on a smaller scale, and we hope that this will focus on the scale of the map of the town and the space delimited by the borders of the actual town, the historical sort of township of Miske versus the borders of the sovereign state. We will produce some kind of ground-up approaches to return which stand in resistance to the strategies and practices of the Israeli nation state. And so from that, I'm just going to show you some. This was hosted in Zuchrot's Gallery in Tel Aviv, and this is sort of the planning teams. And I'm going to talk to you about, it was 4 days it was a site visit and 4 days of workshops, so a lot of work, but I do want to take you to this kind of moment of what we call contact zone, or a moment of conflict in this mapping, so that you dig into the negotiations of space around this issue of return. So an exercise in the mapping workshop in an intermediate step required that we divide into planning teams to chart the existing and the future space. Each team was assigned an area of focus, for instance, movement and transportation, preservation and restoration, public spaces, housing, institutions, agriculture, manufacturing, and industry. In this intermediary stage of the workshop, a team of Jewish group members presented. So each one had to draw a set of proposals, and then they presented their maps. So a team of Jewish members presented their proposed map of the historical village and its surrounding agricultural lands. Their map consisted of a reconstruction of the old town center, preserving its historical village characteristics, which they had left for the planning and design of the actual Miske, so they didn't want to touch the actual reconstruction. But they proposed also, a new location for new housing to be built for the incoming 3 generations of Miskawis, a new modern Palestinian town to be located farther east between 2 existing Arab-Israeli cities of Tira and Tulkarem. This initial proposal generated a heated debate, you might imagine, around density, conservation, and sprawl. And I will sort of go into that a little bit. At first, the Palestinian group co-researchers protested that the plan deemed the historical village static, leaving it stuck in the past. This rationale, they argued, attempts to acknowledge a far-removed Palestinian past, such as the Arab market in East Jerusalem, which has become a touristic site, but they're acknowledging a more recent or an ongoing history of ongoing Nakba is too threatening, since this plan proposed to build a new modern town located further east, and you can look at the map. I don't know if I. Okay, so I don't know how to point in here, but so you can see Tira, and that's the density of Tira versus the density, which is an Arab Israeli town, versus the density of, you can see Miske is over here on your left, and you can see the density around that. And you can sort of start to think of, even if you're not an urbanist, think about what it means, to live in Tira, about infrastructure, education, roads. And this is a city that is supposed to be with people who have Israeli citizenship. So, and then you can look at that area of sort of fairly nicely divided land. And that yellow circle over there is where they propose to establish the new sort of annex of Miske, the modern one. And so they envisioned that it would have, this new modern will have all the necessary infrastructure needed for a highly dense, prosperous urban growth. As one Jewish Israeli group member articulated, as soon as we start talking about the future, we understand that the size of the land and the number of people that should be considered are ever increasing. This amounts to tens of thousands. And so the problems multiply as well, something which is hard for Israelis to deal with. So this debate continued, and Palestinian group members protested that the fact that the proposed new town was far removed to the land and not on historical Miske land. Why can't we simply build on our housing on our lands, the historical lands of Miske? These maps expose an exclusionary ethic that is practiced throughout Israel, by which historical claims over land or historical justice are permitted only to Jews, while Palestinians are excluded from the fight for historical justice. Further, a Palestinian collaborator exposed the plan for a new town will create an all-Arab region, something which is separate and removed from central Israel and will create an additional displacement. So this is basically similar and is just as geographically impossible, and it's so impossible in other ways, and just as based on separatist assumptions and as whatever two-state kind of ideal that people have. And this sort of just dismantled this idea of the two states are even possible in a second, and this one, looking at one town, one village. This argument suggests that that it's not the fight over land and resource per se, but rather the fear from a rising Arab population or Palestinian population that perpetuates the ongoing policy of segregation. The line of thought draws upon density, sprawl, and sort of the spatial language to mask its deeply racist premise. One can read the alarmist discourse around urban sprawl as rooted in a fear of Palestinization or Arabization. As one group member articulated, why is it when it comes down to Jewish city, you call it urban expansion, and when it comes down to an Arab city, you call it overly populated, and you need to limit sprawl? So why am I telling you this? I mean, this is going on, and partly is what I'm telling you this is because this form of social exclusion, first of all, is reiterated around Israel with an elaborate set of practices. And I won't go into the numbers because I don't have time, but it has been shown, and a couple of maps here have shown the land grab. It also shows that the demographic issue is entangled in a fear of refugee. The land issue is entangled in a demographic issue, and all together they create this really big fear. it's a kind of rationale that Jewish Israelis leads Jewish Israelis to suppress Palestinian past and erase it from Israeli landscape and continually erase it from the Israeli landscape, and therefore deny the Nakba. And so one Israeli philosopher, Adi Ophir, says, after all, if we admit to have, says that they say, after all, if we admit to having expelled them, we may have to admit that they have a right to return. So it's a really kind of deeply rooted fear. I'm telling you this because this informed and shaped our discussion, but the map was left behind. It was a critical moment of conflict, but from there we started to negotiate a deeper consciousness, and a complex solidarity was formed, one that really kind of, so the group decided to leave the map behind and think about the countermapping process as one that challenges existing power structures, but at the same time it often reproduces and solidifies existing exclusionary territorial practices. And as such, in order to dispute an existing territorialization of land, or land grab, the mapping group actually absorbed model of sovereign power, private ownership, and mirrored existing Israeli state exclusionary measures. They all came up on this on their own, and then they decided to sort of work through it together and to imagine different ways of working through this. This context zone, a critical moment of conflict in the workshop, also surfaced as a need to navigate and integrate countermapping efforts within broader legal and political systems for effective results, and navigate our group's decision-making process into one of a consensus process. So it was like a second day of the workshop, and since then, and if it wasn't a consensus, we didn't continue. And so now, don't know. So I guess this is another map, which I'll quickly talk about. So basically, so then they started to think, what can we do? And one of the things they did is think about what are the exclusionary practices that the Jewish settlements are doing, and how can we resist them? And one of the ways was basically to do the counter thing. So just directly opposite. What is done to Jews, they will do what the Jews are doing to the Palestinians will do to the Jews. So exclusionary measures, exclusionary planning, zoning as a tactic and planning strategies, where you limit sprawl for particular areas, you limit building for particular areas. So it's done to the Arab Palestinian towns, and so reverse that and do that to all the Jewish settlements around, so that they can't grow anymore. And the expansion is only allowed for Palestinian cities, and it's limited to Jewish cities, for instance. So this map shows that. It also talks about kind of the conflicts of dialectics of nature, how you want to preserve nature when it's close to Jewish settlements, but it's not so. But you don't want to preserve nature when it's close to Palestinian lands, because then you can just continue the density. So it was sort of a way to recreate a natural habitat that used to be there inside the Jewish area, so that it allows for the expansion of the Palestinian miskeh. So I guess I won't go into detail there, but I'd love to talk to you afterwards. This is a housing proposal proposed by one of the third-generation refugee Miskei man who works the land of his father's family, but that is now owned by the Israeli state. So really complex relationship. And he's a farmer and really smart political activist, savvy political activist, but he did not want to draw, and he was very skeptical. He did not want to draw a map. And then I said, okay, well, I'll be your hand, I'm an architect, I can draw, just tell me what you have. And then he started laying out the return to miskeh. How many units? How will they look? How they will be radially sort of shaped? Common spaces. How land ownership will be sort of resisted, so that people can't just. Some people can't just buy Palestinian lands and then rent them out to Jews. So how do you actually think about, claiming back the lands in a way that stays lands, that revitalizes a community and a town? And he had it all figured out, and this is sort of his imagining. And was beautiful. So the final map of the workshop suggests that return is a practice, an activity that moves within a non-chronological dimension between an actual historical space of colonialization and the possibility of return to the future. As members of the group attest, the debates and activities of mapping opened up a space of critical thought around the plan and action of return. A collective was formed summoning a geographical imagination that will facilitate future thinking on the subject of a future return. In the right-hand side of the map, I don't know if you can see it, no, really. So in the right-hand side of the map, so we had like a map legend, which I digitalized, but it was really wonderful before. It says, this is a mapping exercise of the planning for return to Miske. The ideas represent the consensus reached by the mapping group. Return is planned for all refugees. Critical examination is open to all with love. Signed by all the co-researchers and the mapping group members. This map redefined the shape of the problem and generated new ideas of distance, scale, and community. In that, the newly formed political organization around maps suggests that there are ways in which we can explore the material and physical implications involved in refugee return. It proposes a move away from a discussion of a right of return and towards an organized, actual return. And so I guess one more sentence is that my work is dedicated to making space, retreating, dismantling, but also imagining, building, and celebrating return.
You get the PowerPoint up. Can you help me? Okay, maybe as you start that, I'll start the paper in the interest of time. I won't thank the organizers because you've gotten too much praise already. Oh, thank you. That's been great. It's that one. Very good. And can we get it like the whole full screen? Start with this. Okay, so this paper is presented in the spirit of enabling the Palestinian refugees' return, like all papers at this conference. Thank you. And I'll just, so how do I, okay, I'll start here. So I want to keep that question in the air about what is to be done, if you will. Yeah, thanks. May I use that phrase? Okay. But I think to do so successfully requires understanding and analyzing the actual conditions created by Zionism, by the Israeli state in an enduring, abiding political campaign, not simply to preclude any kind of return, but also to erase traces of Palestinian pasts as well, including ownership to many tens of thousands of homes and properties in the Jerusalem, well, throughout the country. I'm going to concentrate on Jerusalem, particularly the lost neighborhoods of West Jerusalem from 48. And what I think we want to be thinking about, or what I propose we should be thinking about, is not just all these other wonderful questions people have been posing and thinking about doing, but also what would Palestinians return to? What is it they will confront if and when they return? Not just cartographically and spatially, but ideologically, in terms of racial politics, et cetera. Now, Israeli governance needs to be understood as colonial governance, as colonial power. That's one of the points of my book. And that's not a particularly controversial assertion here and now. And with it has come the production, that colonial process, the continual making and remaking of colonial power, has come with it a burgeoning colonial knowledge that is as often about what is not said or what is not present or apparently present in the landscape as that which is projected or announced actively. And that process of etching over, or what I call colonial overwriting, is very important. I mean, from an anthropological perspective, to look at the quotidian or to look at local places like the homes I'm going to show you in a few moments, is to look at places that can be read as metaphors for broader colonial realities of appropriation and erasure and overwriting. Colonialism, after all, as we all know, is not simply about sheer coercion and military dominance, torture chambers or concrete walls, for as important as they are. It is also about the creation of emerging symbolic understandings, and cultural understandings about about memory and what places represent, locales represent, and not only what is remembered, but what is also actively forgotten. It's crucially about remaking the terrain such that older notions of ownership and connection and law and even lot number, are destroyed and made impossible to rethink in the future and supplanted with new forms of colonial understandings, connections, laws, street names, etc. And finally, just by introduction, how this functions ideologically is to hide away, and though most Americans will understand this, no matter how politically committed or critical you are of the Israeli state, in the main here, mainstream discourses are all about colonial knowledge being even hiding away the fact that Israeli power is about appropriation, land theft, ethnic cleansing, etc. That is truly one of its crucial features that we misrecognize or not understand. Very violent forces are made to look and appear normal, natural, and innocent. So Palestinian homes have been crucial to this effort, and this paper will examine a few cases that underscore how Israeli forms of exclusion and domination and ethnic cleansing, racist assumptions function in sort of metaphorically in place. And when we're talking about discourses about return, but also about preventing return, it's important to understand the racial underpinnings of this discourse. The fact that the Israelis are actually quite Israeli successive governments are quite explicit about how, to lay it down sharply, the wrong kind of human being cannot come back. That will create an unnatural sort of arrangement. And what exists there now is a natural, sort of divinely inspired form of apartheid. So the wrong kind of human being is discussed and will be, I'll give you examples. That would be the Palestinian, in a very reified way. Palestinians are kind of thingified in this process, as I'll explore a little bit now. So how have the processes of erasure and effacement been accomplished historically over the last, say, 60 years? Here's a map, a colonial document, but a British colonial document, and I guess the light is, we'll see what we can make out. But looking historically, what we see here, I found this in the Israeli municipal archives. This is a colonial map of the neighborhood I'm going to concentrate on, the mostly Palestinian Christian neighborhood of Talbiya in West Jerusalem. Many of you, maybe some of you have been. And this is a British cartographic rendering from 1937. But as you can see, we have a visual representation of the kind of colonial overwriting I'm talking about. So you have, where's that little gadget that you can flash light on the screen? I was at the head that last. Okay, you see roads, many of which were not named during the British period like this, that in Hebrew the Israeli municipality has in the last couple of decades renamed. That's Jabotinsky Road, for instance. This circle was known for the family named Salim, who owned a house and owned much of the property there. The Israelis have named it, you can see in Hebrew, Wingate. It's Ord Wingate Circle or square, right? Kikar. So it's overwritten and written in the last several decades, as well as other features relating to other features regarding plot size and plot numbering. Former Palestinian realms like Talbiya, Katamon, and others are dangerous places for the Israelis because it's very ambivalent. The brilliant Palestinian writer and novelist Anton Shamas has written about what he calls a kind of colonial cannibalism and the deep ambivalence that lies in these places that Israelis both desire. They're the sites of intense status and prestige and cultural capital, the Arab homes as they're called. But they're also sites of danger, potential danger, because they're places that many thousands, tens of thousands of people want to return to. So you have that kind of ambivalence is very important. I've found it very useful to think through the racial politics of this conflict by looking at the anthropologist Mary Douglas's work her aptly named work, Purity and Danger, in which, I'll go through this very quickly, she talks about this kind of racialization and thingification, reification of human beings who are racial subordinates by referring to this concept of matter out of place. This is a really brilliant book because it really is deeply rooted in historical religious understandings of pollution and dirt, but it has real, I think, supremely important racial implications. It can be read, I think, precisely like that, especially when you read the discourse of Israeli governments that refer to Palestinians as matter out of place. And the concept is basically, you know, dirt is okay on your dirty boots are okay on the front stoop, but don't bring dirt into the kitchen, don't bring dirt into the bathroom, don't bring dirt into the bedroom, maybe a little bit of dirt in the bedroom, but you keep the filth, the purity in its proper place. And the Palestinians in this racial metaphor are the filth. Now, one might, if you actually read through the discourses relating to places like the Moroccan Quarter, the former Moroccan Quarter, where a population was, not in 48, but in 67, ethnically cleansed to make way for that large Western Wall plaza, spacious plaza before the Kotel that others referenced yesterday. One of the architects of that, the two architects, primary architects of that, one was Maren Benvenisti, who's now differently configured ideologically, but Teddy Kollek, the former mayor, and he write in their memoirs very openly about how they got rid of this quarter because it obstructed what was sort of what should be a natural arrangement between the Israeli Jewish people and the wall. And what Kollek talks about in terms of getting rid of this place, which they did ruthlessly within a few hours of conquering East Jerusalem, a few days, he said that this place, meaning this place, there used to be a place of worship between the wall and the Moroccan Quarter, but it was maybe 5 or 6 meters wide. And they wanted to expand it, as those who've been there have seen, into a large plaza where national rituals can take place, where soldiers' weapons can be consecrated, etc., as they have. And Kollek said in defending this, he said, that which should have been spacious and bright was cramped and dark. And he said these residents, which he sort of referred to as dwellers of slum hovels, had no special, I'm quoting, in his memoir, no special feeling for this place. And therefore, our special feelings are divinely, sort of, the divine providence here justifies that our special feelings supplant the unspecial attachments. Now, it's kind of ironic that Kollek, whose family came to Palestine in 1930, was telling residents whose families many had been there for that neighborhood for 600 or 700 years, that they had no special feeling. But he, coming from Hungary in 1930, had all the feeling in the world for this. In a tone that betrayed a really distinct colonial self-righteousness, if I may say, he goes on to say later in his memoir, extolling the virtues of his accomplishments in the so-called unified city, he said, quote, referring to the Moroccan Quarter, "In 2 days it was done, finished, clean." That one of the architects of this removal would deploy this language is a point I'd like to make. In recent years, relating both to 48 Palestine but also since, the Israeli historian Benny Morris more explicitly, and I think in 2004, gave an interview to Haaretz in which he basically, I'm paraphrasing, but he's at Harvard this year, so if you want to go over and talk to him and get the exact understanding of his, basically said in 48, we Israelis should have, what he said, quoted as saying, we should have finished the job and expelled all the Palestinians into Jordan. It would have been better for both people. We need separation. Explicit ethnic cleansing. And then an Amy Goodman show a few years ago, he was interviewed and he was asked directly if he still holds by this politics. And he said, yes, it would have been better for both of us. He did use the word people, though, to complicate some of the earlier. Okay, so Benny Morris is at Harvard. I wouldn't imagine Harvard would have to import scholars who support ethnic cleansing. I think they have enough in residence. So let's move to a few case studies. This is the Bisharat home in Talbia. George Bisharat, some of you know, a legal scholar. He's the grandson of the builders of the home. It's a grand home built in the 20s. I'll go through this very quickly because I want to get through a lot. The family still demands the right to return, but it's housed a variety of Israeli political and legal elites. I think the head of the Israeli, the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court lived there at one point. Golda Meir lived there, and she lived there actually a few months before she made the famous statement that there were no Palestinians. It's not like we came and took their land, et cetera. And she was just been living in a Palestinian home. In the early 1990s, an Israeli developer built a barely perceptible, from this angle, third floor onto the original structure, which is done routinely in these old, beautiful Palestinian majority neighborhoods, like Katamon, German colony, et cetera. And that's for market reasons. This is high rent, this is high priced property, and building another unit on top in Talbia, in the fashionable Talbia, in an Arab home is lucrative. And what I want to talk about a little bit is this process, this dynamic of adding on layers on these homes that have been done by primarily Israelis. Professor Salim Tamari has reminded me that Palestinians did this before 48 to their own properties. But in Talbia, the ones I've encountered have overwhelmingly been done by the new Israeli residents who are taking over these Palestinian homes. In the 90s, the Israeli developer built the third floor in an attempt to create some continuity with the former structure. It doesn't always work out well aesthetically, but there is this kind of desired appearance of wholeness and unity and completeness, and a very important colonial trope, this wholeness idea. The idea of the whole, or the unified, which Adorno once referred to as the false whole. Any assertion of a quick essentialist idea of unity and wholeness, as Israel, in fact, deploys to talk about Jerusalem, should be, you immediately reach for your holster when people start talking like that. But with the expansion of these homes, you have this also parallel process in Jerusalem of both expansion, say in Jerusalem, expanding boundaries, expanding settlements, but also overwriting discourse of unity, reunification, wholeness, the eternal, immutable, unified capital of the Jewish people is a common trope. But in this case, it's not simply the structural alterations, but what you also find in a lot of West Jerusalem homes that have been taken over and reconfigured, there is on the side, as you make your way around the Bisharat home, you can see this third floor, which is a beautiful job they did with the windows in relation to the former windows. And then, but there's an attempt to make it look sort of one. But there's a Hebrew inscription on faux Armenian blue tile on the upper left, which is from Kings chapter 8:43, which I'll just translate. It's from the biblical translation I have is, "This house which I have built is called by thy name," which is an actual quote from Kings. And the passage in context, my biblical hermeneutics are not great, but I tried a little bit. The passage seems to be relating to thy being this divine eternal force. This house that the developer built, right, is built in your name. And this thy force is one that must be simultaneously feared and loved, and before which all must be obedient. And that connection which seeks to establish eternal and unrivaled national religious connotations, not just to this home or this place or this locale, but also there's a play in the passage on house, meaning also Jerusalem as house. Thousands of other Arab homes, many hundreds I've seen in Jerusalem alone, have been altered by these new Israeli residents in ways both similar and distinct. And as I said, they serve as metaphors for the manner in which Jerusalem itself has been transformed by the forces of Israeli colonial rule, as much discursively as in any other way. For one parallel is the fact that the city, like the city more generally, the Israeli state, or those they permit, have the authority to make structural changes to these dwellings, but they alone, much like the city. Think of building permits and the trouble Palestinians have, even building with their own funds on their own land. for their own needs. That exclusivity of use means the Palestinian authorship or claims to these homes, but also more generally Jerusalem, is in important ways inscrutable, unalterable, unsayable. Secondly, only Israeli connections and claims to these family places are recognized. The builder makes an attempt to do that in his home that he built, divinely sanctioned, morally sanctioned. And now that means generally a kind of erasure of Palestinian past, but what I write about in the book, following, deeply influenced by Salim and others, is that it also effaces the mixed heritage and the intercommunal life that existed in Jerusalem before 48. That was not, we don't want to be romantic about it. It was pretty modest, but it was far different than it is today, and there were these possibilities, as there were in Tolbiya, there were plenty of Jews who lived there. We'll talk about one in just a second. But some names you'd know. And that has been erased, and that the sort of Zionist project has been very interested in erasing that as almost, it seems, as much as it wants to erase a Palestinian connection historically. A further way of looking at this is in terms of the boundary, if you will, the borders of the home and the borders of the city, which continue, though they're called immutable and they're meant to look like they've been there forever in a way, the homes, the city too, the decidedly unfixed and complete and continually shifting way in which the so-called eternal city of Jerusalem is constantly being remade by the forces of Israeli colonial power. Walking the city of Jerusalem, I won't go into this much, actually walking in the way that Dissertot talks about walking, and this, walking as one walks, one writes a poem of the city and remakes the city all the time, with former residents was very illuminating and taught me a lot about colonialism, taught me a lot about what a lot of these abstract comments by Talal Asad and others about Albert Memmi that are really wonderful analyses of colonialism, but they were always to be very abstract until you actually go and walk with the colonized into realms that they've been cleansed from. And I want to just show you a few examples of this. The Gemel family of Tolbiya had owned a couple of homes in the neighborhood. One at what is now referred to as 12 Disraeli Street, that would be Benjamin Disraeli, illustrates a great deal about the colonial governments and rule I've been talking about. The house is now, it was a mammoth house. Forgot to bring a picture of that, but it's now been subdivided. It was historically subdivided and used both for the residents of wealthy Israelis, only very wealthy Israelis can afford to live here, as well as one part of it was used to create what was called the Nathan Steinberg Center, which was a club for Olim, or new Jewish residents. So it had as its purpose finding homes and acclimating and absorbing new Jewish residents to the country, or people who were making aliyah, as it were, in the very home of a Palestinian family whose home had been taken. Another family home right next door had been altered inside and out to suit the needs of 3 Israeli families, which is not uncommon, including a third floor built on the top. The Palestinian woman, who now in her 70s, who led me around her neighborhood that she knew as a child, was telling me that when she went back in the late 90s, she actually was in conversation with an Israeli leftist who we'll call Orit, one of Israel's best-known anti-Zionist Jewish activists, whose parents actually lived in that house. And they found this out very fortuitously. She and the Israeli woman, Orit, were introduced. They were talking. Orit supports the right of return. She's very politically committed and anti-Zionist. And as Selma, the woman whose name I give her, was talking about her home and how they left and where it was, Orit's face began to show some worry, and then she finally realized that that's where her parents live now. And so they invited Selma in, permitted her entrance, but in a very kind of comradely way, but within these kind of very already existing, fraught with colonial dynamics sort of realities. Another home just down the street is now, we walked up and we saw this plaque in English and in Hebrew, and it read on the door of the plaque, "The Association of Americans and Canadians in Israel," run by the World Zionist Organization, and with the explicit mandate of absorption, or klita in Hebrew, of bringing young Americans and Canadians to Israel and absorbing them. And we saw a schedule of event, some too embarrassing to mention, of really kind of ridiculous things, including a singles mixer, or kind of colonial speed dating that they have every week. And in their publications, they advertise this beautiful old building with patterned tiles as being now used for these various purposes. And they talk about it as a 75-year-old stone structure with patterned tiles. But nowhere, of course, do they talk about the Palestinian genealogy, etc. So these are the kind of Israeli spatial and demographic and cartographic designs I'm interested in sharing today, that are both about cordoning off space, but also cordoning off history as well. And how am I doing in time? 5, okay, good. And I want to emphasize, because those of you who will explore the history of Jerusalem more, some of you already have, will note that it is a very, it's sort of a hidden away reality, these realms of mixed life. And some of the official UNCCP documents and others, there are mappings of places that were very few, I think there are 4 or 5, where they claim there was mixed residential life, Arab-Jewish. Those are the binary they used by then. But Talbia and places like that are not included, even though I've found that there actually was substantial connections, contacts, professional and otherwise, between Arab, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish families. Let me go to the last case in the interest of time. This is the home of Edward Said's family in Talbia. And this is a picture from 2006, when the home, which had actually been occupied by this Christian fundamentalist group from Texas called the International Christian Embassy. They rented it from the Israelis. I don't know how that worked, because they were proselytizing Jews and Muslims. I don't know. It's kind of a no-no in Israel, but there they were. They had moved out, and some developer had been given the mandate. I don't know how the legal operation went exactly. You can see the home in 2006. The Christian embassy is out. This developer has begun to gut the actual house. You can see through the second-story doors how the sort of shorn of the real walls, and it's being gutted. And the old former built form, like the Bisharat home, the Gemel home, and others, are not destroyed, but retained in some way as an address in Talbia, often with an attractive original facade that sort of drips with cultural capital. And what the Israeli developer has done in the last couple of years, when I was there in 2012, was to build on top of it and renovate it, and I'm sure they would say improve the property, I counted 9 units on 3 floors, 2 added floors above the 2 original floors. You'll want to keep in mind this mailbox here, which I'm going to tell you about in a few moments, but probably all of you know the story of Said's home, how it was taken. The family went to Egypt, it was appropriated, and they could never, of course, return, like the other 40,000 odd Palestinians from just the West Jerusalem area and the villages around it alone. In the interest of etching and overwriting, a very interesting feature of the home that I noticed many years ago when the Christian embassy was still there, but through the process of gutting the home and then building this new complex for wealthy Israeli Jews, I noticed the mailbox was retained. And on the mailbox, you can see, I hope you can see, is the name of its resident. At some time, we don't know exactly when Martin Buber lived there, but his name in English and in Hebrew is still on the original mailbox, which the Israeli developers chose to keep. And in faded Hebrew and English, you have Martin Buber. Buber was not the owner, but the resident at one point. He left that home and lived until his dying days in another Palestinian home stolen in 48 by the family named Sununu, and lived there until he died in 65. Buber was not resident very long, but this is the way Israeli colonial authority creates heritage at this site. This is the heritage. This is what is distinctive about its history, this structure's history, and not much else. It's used to assert a heritage, but one which, while seemingly innocent, you can't get any more innocent than Martin Buber, effaces and erases the Said family history pretty thoroughly. So let me just conclude, because I have 0 minutes, or okay. So I was left asking, after, in the course of doing this study, and still now, I ask whether, in fact, when we talk about the right of return and the return to these sorts of places, that none of these Palestinians have given up their assertion or claim to, I was left asking whether, in fact, what the Israeli authorities really fear or find a threat is that kind of mixed former Arab-Jewish residential and commercial areas that existed there. If that idea of hybridity and mixture with that which is pure and that which is impure is not really the largest, what would be one of the major articulations of the opposition to the right of return. It should always be remembered, because colonialism, thanks to my colleagues, it's important to understand colonial racism is such an important feature of colonial ideology. Should be remembered in I think in looking forward to continuing to fight this fight, that the defeat of a racist structure or complex presupposes not only the revolt of its victims, but the transformation of the racists in some way. That may be with us long after colonialism is defeated or run back. But it does require that as well, the transformation of the dominant, and consequently the transformation of both dominant and subordinate communities, those created by chauvinism and hatred. And I'll just end by saying that meanwhile, while we continue to confront colonialism, which I think is a more realistic, immediate sort of fight, Israeli colonial knowledge and colonial urbanism have continued to produce a landscape that denies in its affirmations and that continues to speak in its innumerable silences. Thank you. How do you just blank the screen so it doesn't shine on us? Just make it a black screen so it doesn't shine on it.
Turn off.
Yeah, turn off.
Thank you for the three panelists who provided a fascinating demonstration of counter-cartography. I will make a few comments about the three as an opening for the discussion, and I will cast them in form of questions to the three panelists. I think we can say that the first two presentations were on counter-cartography, or the cartographic case. The third one was about actual disposition of property and its fate today. But the three shared the problematic issues of conceiving past loss and how to reconquest the past in the imagination of the present. In Kiki's or Linda's presentation, we have a very interesting examination of how localism and local notions of reimagining space can subvert and, I suppose, undermine conventional cartography. In a way, I'm a bit puzzled by Kiki's attack on conventional cartography, which she equates with territorialism, almost to the point of throwing the baby with the wash water. I may be misunderstanding her notions, but I will ask you in a very sharp way to clarify, and then maybe you can restate your position. The use of cartography actually in the images of looking at trees through the roof was fascinating. It teaches us how to look at our own environment in a novel way, which not only allows us to use our local space in an imaginative way, but also, as Kiki has demonstrated, to counter the oppressive cartography of the occupier. And the space map, or the roof map, actually is a very good example of this. Discussion of communal land, however, is problematic. One of the most important abuses of return to Musha property actually has been used by Israeli and Zionist cartographers. Most recently, and for the last 10 or 15 years, a great deal of appropriation of land in the West Bank, as before in the Galilee and other areas, especially in the Negev, has been by using ambiguities inherent in communal land. Israelis have systematically converted notions of public domain or Musha' land into public domain, and public domain subsequently into state land. And state land is defined in terms of the Jewish public. In other words, the public is the Jewish public, both in Israel and in the occupied territories since '67. So here we have an example of rethinking communal property to benefit colonial practices, exactly contrary to the suggestion made by Kiki. I must say, in support of Kiki's position, the defense of usufruct and traditional rights to the land has been effectively posited recently, in the last 5 years, by Negev Bedouins claiming their own property in these tribal or communal property. So it's a two-edged sword, and I think you looked at one of the edges, but not the other in this case. So perhaps you can just say something about this at this point. With Einat, I am very overwhelmed actually by her discussion of Miska and the way Zochrot and other groups have been replanning the land. I was a bit curious to know, there's a transition here from symbolic return or symbolic reconquest of loss and actual planning of these communal property in what is became known as decolonized architecture. And the shift from this symbolic assertion of rights to actual planning of extensions to Miska in the vicinity of Tira was a bit confusing to me. Is this an attempt to relink the memories of the past of Miska's claim and pre-48 claims to existing Arab communities and making Tira symbiotically related to Miska, or is it just that Tira happens to be in that region and there's an attempt to bring back Miska into the living conscious of its refugees? I was also interested in your use of the term, the cartographic gaze, and the use of aerial photography, which you have showed us. One interesting aspect of this aerial photography is the lost archive of the Bavarian state of Ottoman and German aerial photography from the 1914, 15, and 16 period. This is a magnificent archival material that allows us to look at the contours of villages and towns and user-fract and land tenure systems from the air, using a new cartographic imagination, but actually looking at territorial aspects, which has been attacked by Quiquivix again. But conventional aerial photography, in this case, can actually be used effectively by the Palestinians to see how things happened before the expansion of new urban settlements by both Zionists and during the British Mandate. And this is a great treasure which hasn't been used, as far as I know, except in a very surreptitious academic manner. And finally, when we come to Tom Abowd's very interesting presentation about Talbiya and Qatamon and Nikforia. Nikforia, by the way, is an area which nobody mentions these days. It appeared on your map. It's the area which Wasif Johari used to live in, and is one of the most ethnographically described in modern biographic literature. But it's the name that has been completely expunged, and I'm very thankful to you for bringing it back to life. What I want to ask Tom and comment on his paper is the following. There has been a sudden paradigmic shift in Israeli and Zionist claims on refugee property in a very noticeable way in the last 12 years. Namely, the Israelis were basically saying that Elifat mat, and that you lost your property, but there was a great loss of Jewish property in Iraq and Egypt and Syria and Libya and Tunis, possibly Morocco, which is a very bad example because most of Moroccan Jews actually were immigrants to Israel. They were not refugees. But in essence, the Israelis were saying that there was an exchange. And why bother with looking at UNCCP records and cataloging these losses when we can just assume that what the Jews lost, many of whom came to Israel, and what the Arabs lost in 48, canceled each other out. And then they did something which is very curious, which you actually referred to, but I think it will be interesting to conclude lessons from it. They began to systematically appropriate Jewish property in East Jerusalem and in areas like Gush Etzion to the south, which used to either belong to Jews or were rented to Jews in long-term contracts as Jewish property. And that was a major mistake in my view, especially looking at the properties that you have described and the expansion of their owners' property. Because what happened is that now they have established very important legal precedents for substantial claims by the descendants of Jerusalemite property in West Jerusalem. And why do Jerusalem is very significant, not because it's the holy city, but because the actual descendants of the owners of these houses now live on the other side, just maybe 200 meters away in some cases. And virtually all of them have Israeli green cards or residencies. So this paradigmic shift in the substitution of property rights is very significant in my view, because first it opens Pandora's box for the Israelis. Second, it undermines the Israeli position about the notions of exchange, and has been, this is the third point which I would like you to address, almost totally unused by the Palestinians and their supporters in bringing forth this anomaly in looking at Palestinian property and executing, in fact, the restoration of property and restitution in practice, given this sudden shift in the Israeli Zionist paradigm. So I will stop here and ask you to respond to them, but perhaps, I don't know, what do you want to do? Do you want to take... Okay. You can respond.
No, this is on. Thanks so much, Salim. And thank you for allowing me to clarify some stuff. In 20 minutes, we really can't do that much. I guess I will begin with the second of the two questions. One on which is on the communal, on the Israel and Zionist exploitation of the ambiguities of the Mashah system in order to claim public domain lands. What I want to say about that I think is really important for us to recognize is that the whole idea of Zionist Jewish settlers coming in to buy land, it provides a cover for how exactly the land was taken, and that was through violent means. Less than 10% of the land was actually purchased, was actually owned, but more than half the land was violently taken, and that's something that we don't talk enough about with maps and how they come to match the landscape from paper through war and through these kinds of violence and policing, and then become naturalized by going through mechanisms of normalization. Which the courts is one of those. And so what was important in understanding what happened, why the British wanted to destroy Mashah land, like I try to point out, is that they wanted to discipline people to get used to this idea of going to the courts, where they were doing quite well trying to figure out the borders on their own in relationships where they were accountable to each other. And that's what I want to point out, the relationship of exercising this kind of power from below rather than having to tell or ask somebody what to do, allowing the exercise of power from above. And that relates then to the question, I think, about should we do away with territory and conventional cartography? And this I think, is something that I can speak to in relation to the question of last panel, should we do away with law? And I don't think that we should do away with law, like I don't think we should do away with maps. But I do think that we need to have a different kind of relationship to law and to maps, where right now, as it stands, we believe that law and maps are going to provide the solution. They become the strategy, and this has become quite evident in the Palestinian leadership, where you actually see the abundance of maps in the negotiations, and even language saying, give me the borders, it will solve everything. It will solve settlements, water, Jerusalem, it won't solve the refugees, right? So for me, I can give an example of how movements have made this distinction of should we use land, should we use law? And I'll go back to the Zapatistas, since that's how I opened, and how I mentioned that they do not claim themselves to be an indigenous rights movement. However, they do exploit indigenous rights law as much as they can, as long as that use of law is only a tactic for their broader strategy of autonomy. If it becomes the strategy, then it's already bankrupt. And right now, the way that the Palestinian leadership is relating to law and largely to land, to maps, is that those are the strategy. The map is the solution. And I'll wrap up by just clarifying that I don't think that we should throw the Cartesian map away, the idea of territory. I think territory is important. The control of space is important. for movements, but it depends on the way that we relate to them. But also, a territorial conception of space is not wrong. It's just one of many different kinds of conceptions of space. Territorial maps are just one way of mapping space, as we saw with Jerusalem.
Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you for these wonderful comments, insightful, and yeah, okay. So I'll try to be brief. The one thing that I might have been unclear about is that intermediary map in which they put the one sort of modern town removed from Miske. It's, first of all, it's 2 kilometers removed, about 2-minute drive removed. It was a rationale of the Jewish group members to sort of think that they can't touch the holy ground of historical Miske, whereas the particular Palestinian Miskais who participated in the workshop, they said that they're holding the center of town as something that they want to preserve, the center of old Miske, want to rebuild and preserve, but they do want Miske to be a vibrant, dynamic, urban city with now 10,000 estimated refugees coming back. And so they had a very particular vision in which they don't want to separate the urban infrastructure and the sort of historical landscape. They wanted to make it vibrant. And so I tried to convey that, but it came through the debate. It didn't come from those who thought about the issue, which were Jewish. And it goes to the larger framework of how do we think about the past and the past cartographies. And so one of the things we did, and I didn't talk about it at all, is that after a site visit, which was led entirely by the Miskais, each person, one of the people in the workshop brought maps. Some of the maps were mental maps drawn by their ancestors, their fathers, grandparents, of what Miske used to look like, but also we used 1880 map. The oldest map was from 1880, and we traced Miske on the map. What we really looked for, because we had a short amount of time, is what was the sort of built versus agricultural land of Miske, and if there are any particular transportation routes or linking to other Middle Eastern cities or other cities in Jordan and in Egypt. And we did find that there was a very big route coming all the way down from Egypt, all the way through Haifa, up north. And so it was like a small village with a very particular position as a route of, and they had a sort of a hotel for people to rest on the way. So there was a covering of this, and probably not sufficiently, thinking about all the particular models of property rights, but very, very, very much appreciated and a thing to explore. And the third was that this was a case study of managing return in local ways, but we of course complicated it with the idea that this cannot happen without the dismantling of a particular of the state of this particular state of Israel, and the way that it's racist and land grabbing and built on racist assumptions. So that was the first assumption, and the second assumption is also that after we felt the workshop was pretty useful in navigating this kind of space of return. We felt we started developing ideas of how this countermapping table can be for every one of the villages in Professor Abasita's maps. We already know where the villages were. We already know where the refugees are located, and we also know the numbers. And we have the networks. And so, how can we do this? Negotiate in local ways. Have similar countermapping and other facilitated tables around the issues of return, and then link them together for strategy. For organizing around the return of the entire people. And so the political imagination of how to do that came after the workshop, but it was stated. So that's, thanks.
Which one of these ones? Okay, so is this on? No? It is, okay. So Salim's mentioned these two cases in which Jewish land in both the broader Middle East and also East Jerusalem has been dealt with in the last decade or so, by the latter in the last decade or so, by the Israelis, who are making now claims on this, what was a small amount of property on what we now regard as East Jerusalem. And does that not open up Palestinians' legal claim to land, the far greater land, talking about tens of thousands of homes that were appropriated from them during the 48 war, many thousands in Jerusalem alone. And, the broader question, which you do hear from time to time, although not at this from dissenters, not at this conference apparently, but who often stand up and make that claim, seems to me that claim turns on, I hate to keep using the word again, a kind of essentialist idea of the Arabs or the Middle Easterners, the Arab. They're all just Arabs after all. They took our land and we are we. And so we can take their land, whoever they are, we define them as. It should be noted, it should be self-evident why this is ridiculous, and Susan Akram put it much better than I could possibly in the earlier panel about how this has nothing to do with the Palestine-Israel conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict, what was left or taken in Egypt or Morocco. And actually the Palestine-Israel conflict can be settled without this issue, which I think should be taken up, it's an important one, being resolved. And so I think at the first level of analysis or counterattack, you have to make that claim. The Palestinians had nothing to do with what happened in Egypt or Morocco, etc. And so that's, I think, really important. But you do hear now increasingly, oh, well, it's an exchange of land. Here's the other thing that I think is important in arguing, and I support the rights of those people who lost land in those countries to get it back. But there's not exactly parity here in experiences, or even I think in principle, though the claims are both meritorious, I think. And this is why not. On one level, if you think about it, the right to national self-determination of those Jews who came from Middle Eastern countries is not in question. They have a state, they have state subsidies, they're discriminated against in all the ways that we've been talking about in this conference, but they have the right to national self-determination, and the Palestinians do not. And so to compare the losses of the Palestinians to those who are now Israeli citizens in one of the 30 wealthiest countries in the world is kind of a bit bizarre on that level alone. But this new twist that you've illuminated me about, although I had heard about it, which is this increasing tendency of the Israeli authorities, state and semi-private, to make claims on Jewish properties, the relatively small amount of Jewish properties in what we today regard as East Jerusalem, that opening up possibly Palestinians' use of the law to get back their land. My only question is in what courts and under which law would the Palestinians make that claim? I mean, Israelis' notion of absentee is defined kind of in a discriminatory way, as I understand it. And it's written into it. It was originally, as I understand, the absentee property law was the enemy property law, which defined out of legal, the Palestinians ceased to have claim to these homes they left because they went to an enemy country. Or they fled for reasons of war. This was actually rather than for business purposes or what have you. And so on that, so I would want to know, given that Israel makes a claim on all of Jerusalem, how that would be fought. And I would need to know more, and I'm sure others could help illuminate us on this. But it's a very good question. I want to explore it further for sure.
So with that, I just would like to ask first for another round of applause for all of our amazing panelists. I think you can probably agree with me that those were a number of mind-blowing presentations with great visuals. So very much appreciated. Not to be really boring, but I need to update you on time. Currently, we're about 45 minutes behind time, and so with your consent and in the interest of having a robust Q&A right now, I'd like to ask that we cut lunch to be about half of the time, so it would be about 30 minutes, so that way we can have a much more substantial discussion right now with the panelists, so if everyone's good with that. Okay. Cool. So what I'm going to ask is that everyone who's interested in asking a question, please line up behind one of the two mics. It seems that people are getting familiar with the format. But I'm going to remind you once again to please keep your questions. Please keep them very brief. Mention your name and your affiliation. And please try and make it clear who you're directing your question to if there's a specific panelist. Sorry, I might not have been speaking into the mic. But, so let's take 2 or 3, and then we'll do some answering, and then if we have time, we'll continue to another round. So can we start here? Can we make sure the mic's right? Okay, the mic should be on. That mic doesn't appear to be.
Hello, there we go.
Okay.
Hello, Sharif Sakut from Committee for Justice in Palestine, University of California, Santa Cruz. First off, I'd like to say I'm very thankful and privileged to be in a space with so many beautiful people. Thank you once again. This question is more for Einat. We've seen a lot of, I guess, proposals on how we can bring back the diaspora to Palestine. And I was wondering if you've tackled on the question of how resources would be divided and whether or not you've used sustainable land practices in your plans, because I want to know more about environmental racism happening within the ground. And realistically, I know if right of return was implemented today, those are some of the issues we would probably face. Thank you very much.
Do you want to take from that side?
Hi, my name's Danny Brick. I don't have an affiliation, but I'm a playwright and actor in Boston, and my current project is a play based on interviews I conducted with people in Palestine and Israel, so that's sort of my immediate connection. My question is about some of the things that Tom brought up. You were talking about this, this notion of false wholeness, and it reminded me of something that I've heard a lot from Israelis who identify as liberal, this idea of Jewish character, which to me always seems like a euphemism for enforced majority. But the fear seems to be if we open up the floodgates to right of return to a single state, then we lose the ability to have this like controlled laboratory for developing the Jewish character. And along with it, connected to that, these other kind of familiar aspects of the narrative you brought up of there's no such thing as Palestinians, it was an empty land, there has been a continuous Jewish presence here, there, and here. And so this maybe is actually addressed more to the two of you. I'm wondering if you know of examples of this being done or how you could see it being done, of how a new cartography could visually sort of address and deconstruct some of these concepts and sort of show, like, okay, what does this mean, Jewish character? How does this look on the ground now, and how would it look post-return or post-single state? How can we sort of deconstruct these notions of there was nobody here and also they left on their own or whatever? Visually, not to suggest that these mentalities deserve to be addressed, but only that perhaps it would be useful. And I'm curious about how cartography can do that.
And then let's take a last question from the side.
All right. Is it working? Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank you. It was a really beautiful panel. My question is mainly to Kiki about the last map that you showed. The first time that I've seen it, there's something about it that's like so incredible and awe-inspiring, and I related it to a friend, and the first thing he said was, well, wouldn't that be really dangerous? Like once you sort of put down these lived experiences, I'm sure Zionists
are well aware of what goes on in this conference, for instance. And when we explore these counter possibilities, we're also opening ourselves to the possibility of those being used. And kind of how, when we're countering this, we can also be thinking of resisting the use of that against us, like countering that. But I think like I would be happy if other panelists would address that as well.
Oh, and name and affiliation.
My name is Mika, and I'm affiliated with the Brown Students for Justice in Palestine.
So whoever feels compelled to start the discussion.
Me? I'm going to answer Sharif's question because I know the answer to that one. The other one is too complicated, I think. So you asked about once we bring in the diaspora, how is it going to be are we going to exhaust the current resources? How is it going to be divided? If the workshop co-researchers paid any attention to that, and yeah. So yes, we thought about it a lot. And the assumption is that if Palestinian justice and right of return cannot happen if Israelis keep, it's not only colonialization, but keep holding on to private property in the ways that they do. So you have to dismantle this kind of model of appropriating space, whether it is nature or it is people's homes. It is all produced socially, and therefore the implications are real to how much you can exhaust it. So it's a very clear solution. You have to clear out, make do with less, give back, and then envision an environmental justice around that. You don't need so much. What you are doing now it's already abusive, what's happening now. So I don't think that the particular numbers that are coming, the entire amount that could come in, and as a planner and an architect, I can say that this project has material implications. The material implications mean that if Jews do not disaggregate from their land, they would exhaust every resource they have, including, and they will never achieve any kind of environmental justice. And so the fight for environmental justice has to be with the fight for social justice, and therefore that was part of the models that we explored. So yeah, clear out. And then rethink. And we did think about particular industries and particular sort of mechanisms that, in the same way that limit sprawl, in the same way they sort of expand natural resources and bring back to life the natural landscape. What we don't want is to use the environmental discourse as pretext for kind of pseudo-leftist work, which happens a lot in Israel. So you have these environmental activists, but they're not talking about justice for Palestinians. And so Miske, part of there was a road that was supposed to be paved through Miske, through the cemetery of Miske. And Zuchot's directorate then, Inton Bernstein, was we wrote a letter together protesting this road. And this other organization, which is sort of the center-left, they call themselves environmental activists in Israel, they said, don't worry, we got it covered. Like, don't bring your Palestinian politics in here, because we really want to just stop this road from ruining this like natural habitat. And so they really stopped the road, and it's not going through Miske, but under what kind of discourse were they silencing and erasing while doing that? So I have a really big problem with the way that leftist activists are taking the natural sort of environmental justice and obscuring Palestinian justice and social justice. And so for me, it's all social justice, and it's all about distributional justice, and it works in the similar ways where it's build houses, roads, schools, and trees. Yeah.
Well, maybe just quickly in response to this gentleman over here, appreciate the question. I would just, rather than try to say anything more about what I think right this second, would point you to because there's a kind of homogenizing. There's an idea that the argument for Jewish character is held by all Israeli Jews or all Jews. And I would just point you to two sources that might be interesting on this question. One is the anti-Zionist French historian Maxime Rodinson, who's not with us anymore, but who was an anti-Zionist, who wrote a little-known pamphlet, but very good pamphlet called Israel, a Settler Colonial State, ? Then he goes in and talks about the kibbutzim and the moshavim as being part of a settler colonial project. And the work of Israel Shahak, another Israeli humanist who was kind of a Spinoza-esque liberal secularist who also was opposed to a Jewish state. But Rodinson, you can find this piece in his collected essays. He was asked, he was in this conference of radicals in France. He said, listen, I'm against this idea, but mostly of a Jewish state, but mostly because it's built on someone else's land. If Zionists wanted to go to the moon and do this, I would not be opposed to it. And they record laughter in the transcript. And I remember talking to Israel Shahak, who's also no longer with us, about this, and he said, no, even if they went to the moon, I'd still be against Zionism because I'm against separatism. And this idea that we are one, any of us, one thing, one identity primarily. That's the roots of fascism, really, right? I mean, that you are this above all other things. Before you're a worker, before you're a woman, before you're a person of color, you are an American, first and foremost, and now march in line. So, I mean, I would reference those two great thinkers and leave it at that for now.